I, for one, hope that this conference will be one of those rare occasions where everyone will have the chance to rise above the politics of the moment and achieve true statesmanship.
The climate summit has started and the pressure is on. Britain sets ambitious goals for the countries here, but after day one, there are signs that some big players like India will move more slowly. Also tonight, everybody gets it in theory, but what are we actually willing to sacrifice in the fight against climate change? Good evening from Glasgow, where world leaders have gathered at the climate summit. There are issues at stake were serious was made very clear to them today. The Archbishop of Canterbury saying they'd be cursed if they didn't tackle climate change. Sir David Attenborough argued a failure to see the bigger picture could result in the end of humanity. And Boris Johnson said the leaders would face the anger of unborn billions if they didn't grasp the nettle. Their response? Well, Narendra Modi said India would finally set a date for net zero emissions in 2070. President Joe Biden appeared to fall asleep at one point, and President Xi of China couldn't react because he's not here. That gives some idea of the hill that Boris Johnson has to climb as summit host if he wants to produce tangible results during the next 2 weeks. But as we come on air, progress at least on the issue of deforestation. Nick Watt, our political editor, is here. Nick.
Well, Mark, great excitement in UK government circles about that announcement tomorrow on deforestation. So leaders representing 85% of the world's forests will commit to halting and reversing deforestation and land degradation by 2030. And crucially, this includes Brazil, Russia and Indonesia. It is important to say that this does build on a 2014 agreement that was signed in New York in 2014, but there are big differences here. The first is that the actual world leaders, the leaders of these countries, are putting their signature to it, and there is big public and private investment behind it, and the hope is that that will really push delivery on this. And as you say, this has come after that announcement by Narendra Modi, the Indian Prime Minister, that India will reach net zero emissions by 2070. Now, that is obviously a very long way off, but the UK government is encouraged that the Indian Prime Minister did also set a new target of ensuring a 45% cut in the carbon intensity of the Indian economy by 2030. And that really matters because there is that global target of halving carbon emissions by 2030.
So, big picture, where does that leave the summit?
Well, obviously, the key goal of this summit is to ensure that average global temperatures rise by no more than 1.5% degrees over pre-industrial levels. Where we are now, we're heading to 2.7 degrees, and that has potentially catastrophic consequences. Now, that Indian announcement, that will shave a little bit off that. There are going to be more announcements this week, I understand, on phasing out domestic coal consumption. Boris Johnson inadvertently blurted out the Indonesian target this last week to do that by 2040, and there will be more. So what that means is that Boris Johnson's realistic hope at the end of this COP26 conference is not to hit 1.5, but to show that there is tangible progress towards that 1.5. So look, today was the first full day, I was out and about in Glasgow, where the climate protesters really did make their presence felt.
Wrapped up against the autumnal chill, but still in full throat.
And what are we going to do? Climate justice, that's right!
And a riposte to Boris Johnson, who'd opened the day, citing her famous saying that these gatherings amount to no more than blah, blah, blah.
No more blah, blah, blah! No more blah, blah, blah! No more blah, blah, blah!
A short distance over there, Boris Johnson framed his opening remarks around the anger over here. He said it's justified. He quoted Greta Thunberg. Well, you can see the response. It's a pretty clear thumbs down. what did you think about Boris Johnson framing his introduction, quoting Greta Thunberg, blah, 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 and saying your anger is justified?
Well, isn't he just doing what his people do, the colonizers do? They're stealing. He's totally stealing words.
The action is not enough now, so it's like defeating and empty words like everyone says and so many blah, blah, blah. So we want climate justice, we want gender justice, we want social justice because there's no human rights without the climate crisis consequences, so that's
What
it.
do you think when you hear Boris Johnson say, look, his goal is to keep it at 1.5 degrees?
It's like sad, I think. We have to be more ambitious.
Frustration after a chaotic start to the day. Perhaps with an inauspicious signal from the heavens as the conference opened in sullen mood. The core target of keeping average global temperatures no higher than 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures could be in trouble after the richest countries failed to agree to phase out coal consumption. And they still have not met a $100 billion target to help poorer countries adapt to existing climate change. On the upside, there'll be agreement on deforestation tomorrow, and possibly moves later to cut methane.
Please welcome the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Boris Johnson.
A gloomy assessment from the man in the chair.
2 degrees more and we jeopardise the food supply for hundreds of millions of people as crops wither, locusts swarm. 3 degrees and you can add more wildfires and cyclones, twice as many, 5 times as many droughts and 36 times as many heat waves. 4 degrees and we say goodbye to whole cities.
Grave warnings, but also an upbeat note from the world's second largest emitter.
We're standing at an inflection point in world history. We have the ability to invest in ourselves and build an equitable, clean energy future, and in the process, create millions of good-paying jobs and opportunities around the world.
Not the most scintillating of days for this president. But from a senior Tory, progress is being made.
Well, these conferences are iterative processes. It's an evolution. It's not a revolution overnight. You're not going to change behaviour. So I think we've seen a really important commitment by the 2 biggest nations in the world who are emitters at the moment. You know, first of all, the change in president in the United States means that President Biden is in the room. He's reversing the position that the US was taking under the previous administration. That's vitally important. And secondly, China has made a commitment to go net zero by 2060. They've never done that before.
That are also not being
Huddling together, within earshot of world leaders, protesters show they are here to stay.
again.
Well, we're joined now by Allegra Stratton, the Prime Minister's COP26 spokeswoman, Rob Cameron, Global Head of Public Affairs for Food and Beverage Corporation Nestle, and climate change activist Michaela Loach. Welcome to you all. Allegra, let's start with you and the situation we see tonight. India, net zero by 2070. That is a disappointment, surely.
No, it isn't, Mark. It's a country with 1.4 billion people. Narendra Modi talks about wanting his country to develop economically.
Of course, but 2050 is the aim, isn't it, of this conference?
2070 is positive. It's more than we thought. If you think about where we were, certainly when I spoke to you last in the summer, where we hadn't got these big net zero commitments from the G20. When Alok Sharma started this process, we had just 30% of the world covered by net zero. Now, tonight, we are at triple that. We're up at nearly 90%. Indeed, we may be at 90%. I'll come on to India in a second. So the overall picture tonight is absolutely positive. On India in particular, for this country that wants to be able to economically develop at the same time as deal with carbon emissions, it was more than we expected. And there's more than that. If you look at what they're doing this decade, which is the absolute priority for us in the next 2 weeks at COP26, they are saying they'll be at 50-50 on renewables by 2030. They are saying that whereas they were going to go for 450 gigawatts of renewable energy, it's now 500. So there are positive positive pictures that mean independent analysts, don't take my word for it, but independent people think that it's a set of policies that is consistent with 2 degrees. Now, we want to be going to 1.5, and that is what we are pushing for. And that's why you heard the Prime Minister's language today saying that right now we are not yet hearing enough. Going into COP26, we were at 2.7 degrees. We need to be getting it closer to 1.5.
But doesn't the Indian announcement today and the one we had from China in their nationally determined contributions just before the summit, that they're going to keep increasing the output until just before 2030, doesn't that underline the limits of what a host can do, of what the Prime Minister can do with 2 big emerging economies like that, still increasing their emissions for some years to come?
Far from it, Mark, because at the G20, we also had the move to completely end the international financing of coal. So we are moving forward, but that is why the Prime Minister
progress,
said
but it's a different plane.
It's
not stopping these huge emerging economies increasing their emissions.
We're pushing on every single front we can. We have the World Leaders Summit for the next 2 days. Then we have these themed days, the first of which is cash, the second of which, on Thursday, is coal. You will see during those days more and more commitments from different countries. If you like, it's about ambition, then it's about action, then it's about acceleration. Coming into COP, we needed to get these net zero commitments. We've had, first of all, the G20 was the first G20 that was net zero. We actually said it in the communique. I'm sure you studied it in depth. We've heard from the Indians today. We have now a net zero commitment from them. Some weeks and months ago, we didn't have that. We also have the granularity of the renewable commitment. And then we will have the action over the next 2 weeks on coal, cars, cash and trees. It matters because they are the big levers we will be pulling that will allow us to bring down emissions by this decade. And then we need to accelerate because we need to go faster. Nobody is hiding that. You know, you couldn't have the Prime Minister be clearer in his speech today. We are at 1 minute to midnight. We need to hurry up.
Go faster, but still fly internally from London to Manchester if you want to, when many European countries are looking at stopping that. What's the moral argument for saying, in this situation, in this climate emergency that the Prime Minister sketched out today, sure, we'll take an internal flight?
Personal choice. Personal choice is running through this entire agenda. But also...
You have to make hard choices in the common interest eventually.
But personal choice, individual choice, and this Prime Minister is not going to stand up and tell anybody the choices that they should make, but what he will do...
Really?
No, he's not. And he doesn't do, if you listen to him. But what he does do is take the decisions in Whitehall that mean that the technology is liberated and given the best chance of coming on stream quickly enough. You saw it in the net zero strategy. You've seen money going into sustainable aviation fuel. That, in the end, will mean, jet zero as we call it, will mean that flights are lower carbon. Not right now. I'm not pretending it is right now. But if you're particularly talking about internal flights, they are a very, very small fraction of the carbon emissions that we need to be bringing down.
Let's widen it out, because there are some other actors in these equations, of course, including the corporate ones, giant corporations like Nestlé, a very nice profit for shareholders, £9.9 billion. But what would be the harm in sacrificing some of that in the interests of a more green corporate effort?
Yeah, well, you know, we've heard a lot in the last 24 hours and in the run-up to this COP that it's code red for humanity. And, you know, this is true, and it's not new news. We've known about this for some time, and it's why many of us in the business community have been focusing our efforts on addressing our emissions, and our company, Nestlé, is no different. But what we have done, which is perhaps a little bit different, is that in December 2020, we published our net zero roadmap. We were one of the first, if not the first, major food and beverage companies to set out a course which charts the reduction of our emissions to net zero by 2050.
But as a responsible company, I mean, on the one hand, big profits, great. You know, the people in the financial world love it, shareholders love it. But isn't there an interest to sacrifice some of that in terms of the way the company's perceived, the actions it takes, the reality of its policies, the amount of waste?
Yeah, so if you look at actually what we announced You know, we've actually announced some really substantial investments. And what we have to do, because what we have to do is not really 2050 that counts, it's the next 5 or 10 years that count. And that's why we're investing 1.2 billion Swiss francs in sparking regenerative agriculture by 2025. And that's a huge investment in a massive transformation of our agricultural supply chains.
Michaela Loach, let's bring you in. Impressed by what you've heard so far?
I mean, absolutely not. Absolutely not. I think that I'm actually just frustrated and also heartbroken. I think so often what we hear is just all this greenwashing and all of this like pursuit of this social license to exist of these big corporations, and especially from Boris Johnson, like quoting Greta Thunberg in his speech when he ignores what climate activists want, what everyone wants actually is a livable future, and he's still pursuing new oil and gas licenses, which is not something that a climate leader should do, and also is completely inconsistent and incompatible with a 1.5 degree target and a livable future. So yeah, it's all been incredibly frustrating.
What would you like to see a big food company like Nestle doing?
I think that sustainability goes beyond just, I guess, emissions and things like that. It goes beyond how they treat their workers and how they treat the people in their supply chains. It goes into removing modern slavery from your supply chains, because we can't have climate justice without the justice part. We can't have that without looking after people. And the huge amount of harm that Nestle has done all over the world cannot be undermined or ignored. And I think that big corporations like this that pursue profit over anything else are never going to get us any sort of sustainability or a good future.
I really would like to come back on that, because one of the things we talk about a lot, and our chief executive talks about this a lot, is this notion of a just transition. We simply have to work with people in local communities. That's why we support farmers. We have 500,000 farmers around the world working directly with them to help them make the transition. I'll give you another example when it comes to forests. That's a big subject for tomorrow. You know, deforestation, ending deforestation is absolutely priority for us. But the key thing then is to move forward to what we call a pro-forest agenda, where we bring in the issues of human rights, indigenous people and local communities, and looking at forests through the lens of human rights. That's the way to have something that's more about something you're for rather than stopping. And I completely agree with what Kayla says. You absolutely have to bring human rights into this forests agenda.
Right. And in terms of mobilising people, something you are passionate about, to what extent does the ability to mobilise people in China or India, or the lack of that, worry you and pose a challenge for mass movements in this?
I think I'd prefer to focus on mass movements in the UK, because I think that when we talk about where the responsibility lies for the climate crisis, like where kind of this economic model that has created this crisis was created and then exported, I think that that responsibility lies very heavily with countries like the UK, like European countries and the US. And I think that these countries and the people within them are the people who have the responsibility to decarbonise here as quickly as possible, and realising that, yes, it's a different situation in other countries, purely also because of the difference in time that's been allowed for an economy to develop elsewhere. And therefore, I think it's important that we focus here in the UK on mobilising people, especially with COP happening here and with this UN climate summit happening in the UK. We must use this opportunity to highlight the hypocrisy that this UK government has around climate. They say they're climate leaders, and they're wanting to approve new oil and gas fields. They say they're climate leaders, and they give £4 billion of public money to the North Sea oil and gas companies since 2016.
Well, let's come back. Michaela, sorry, let's come back to Allegra on this. Decarbonise as quickly as possible, which seems to be in tune with what you were saying earlier, but you were putting it still down to personal choice.
I was about to say PM would agree with absolutely everything Michaela just said, until she went on to... Michaela, PM would completely agree with you, and I think he said it in his speech. We have a responsibility. What was the question?
So would Boris Johnson say that we should stop the Cambo oil field and we should not be approving any new oil and gas?
So what I was going to say is the Prime Minister completely agreed with you, and the point of his speech was that we have a responsibility as one of the countries that has developed and enjoyed economic development based on oil. We have a responsibility now to help those countries who also want to develop, and we will do that through technology, and we will do that through innovation, and we will do that through spreading all of the gains that we are seeing with our tech in the United Kingdom, we will spread that, and that is what will help eventually net zero become reality, and all of us nail this decade, because that's fundamentally what you're talking about as well.
Okay, I'm sorry.
So what I'm saying is that we need to have, we
bring
can't just be pursuing net zero. We have to have real zero.
I'm agreeing with you. It's about action this decade, and that's what the Prime Minister was very clear about today.
Thank you very much, Allegra Stratton, Michaela Loach, Rob Cameron. Thank you for joining us. Well, look, central to this summit is the hope of keeping 1.5 alive. That's the goal of trying to limit global warming to that amount rather than the 2.7 Celsius or higher it's currently projected to reach in the coming years. What difference might that make? Well, even fractions of a degree can have significant impacts on the climate and sea level. That's a message we heard repeatedly today from small island nations and countries prone to large-scale flooding. Here's Ben Chu at the Wall.
Yes, Mark, in recent weeks we've had high-profile net zero pledges by governments such as Saudi Arabia, Russia and China, and today, India. So should that reassure us as COP26 begins? We're now on the way to solving the climate problem? The answer is not really. According to UN researchers, even with most of those new pledges, we're still probably on course for 2.7 degrees Celsius of global heating relative to the pre-industrial average. That's the red line here, showing emissions on the current trajectory out to 2050. So well above the 1.5 degree heating being targeted by Boris Johnson at this conference. That would be consistent with the green line here on the 2050 net zero emissions trajectory. Now, 2.7 is much better than projected at the time of the Paris COP in 2015, showing that progress has been made, yet it's still above the temperature rise considered tolerable for our modern civilization, according to the consensus of researchers.
What we will experience in the future, and what we are starting to experience already, is outside of what our society has developed to. We have been experiencing an extremely stable climate over the last centuries, and everything we do on Earth is designed within that temperature range. And that means getting out of it, our societies are just not made for that.
Now, it's worth taking a step back and thinking about what that figure, 2.7 degrees, means. This is a global average temperature we're talking about, taking in the heat of the equator and the cold of the poles over a year. The global average planetary temperature through most of modern human history has been around 14 degrees. 2.7 degrees higher would take us into uncharted territory. Now we're already about 1 degree above historical global averages, as the red bars here show. And we're already seeing more extreme weather that scientists say is consistent with the predicted effects of man-made climate change. As mentioned, the PM wants to keep 1.5 alive by galvanising action from world governments at this COP. So is there really that much difference between 1.5 and 2.7 degrees of warming? The answer from the scientific community is yes. Take heat waves. According to a survey of peer-reviewed climate studies by Carbon Brief, with 1.5 degrees of heating, you get 14% of the global population facing at least one severe heat wave every 5 years. With 2 degrees, that rises to 37%. With 3 degrees, scientists expect much more severe and widespread heat waves. Take sea levels. With 1.5 degrees, we're predicted to get a 48 centimetre rise. With 2 degrees, you get a 56 centimetre rise. With 3 degrees, you get the potential breakup of the West Antarctic ice sheet and possibly more than 1.5 metres of sea level rises. It's a similar story of escalating damage in terms of drought, biodiversity loss, the economy. We could go on and on. The key point to take away from all this is that in terms of climate impacts, the scientific consensus is that we should not expect a small step up in intensity with every degree we go up the thermometer.
The more extreme the events, the larger the changes are with increasing temperatures, and particularly the damages that these extreme events cause are changing exponentially in many cases rather than linearly with the warming.
Think then of the kind of explosive growth in harm we saw in the pandemic. Think too of a series of potentially disastrous tipping points which cause a drastic and self-reinforcing acceleration of warming. That's why it really does make a world of difference whether we have a 1.5 degree warmer planet or a 2.7 degree hotter Earth. Mark.
Sobering stuff, Ben. Now we're joined by Pernell Charles Jr., Jamaican Environment and Climate Change Minister and co-chair of the NDC Partnership, a global initiative that helps countries achieve their nationally determined contributions, so-called, or climate commitments. Welcome to Newsnight. Climate change is already a very real thing, isn't it, for an island nation like Jamaica?
Exactly. We had 31 storms, 14 became hurricanes, and 7 major hurricanes in the Caribbean in 2020. So it's not the future, it's now for us.
And in terms of the news we've had today, a big country like India saying, yes, we will get to net zero, but only in 2070, is that helpful?
There are 20 years between 2050 and 2070, and a lot can happen in those years. For countries like Jamaica, small island developing states, we see this issue from a different perspective. It's not just transitioning, it's about the lives that may be lost during that time. 1.5 is not, at least beyond 1.5, is not a safe climate for this world, much less us, the most vulnerable countries. 2 degrees is way too far. 1.5 gives us just half a chance. And so the targets that are set by our developed partners and countries has to reflect the urgency of action that is needed. The urgency is now. And so we are concerned with the targets. We are pushing for it to be more ambitious, and we're pushing for the targets to represent exactly what we need to do if we are going to tackle the climate crisis. It moves us to the money, the cash that is required for us to care. And delivery of climate financing is one of the greatest issues for small island developing states. We talk a lot about 100 billion.
Which is supposed to be in place by 2023. Is that enough?
But that figure comes from a long time ago when we were discussing issues back then. In 2021, we have moved beyond the projections and we're in a worse situation. It means we have to re-examine and we have to make sure that that money is impactful and is achieving its purpose and objective. It's a target, but it's not the objective. The objective is for the money to work for the farmer, for the fisher folk in Rocky Point in Jamaica, and to make a difference in their lives. And so we're talking about breaking down, tearing down the barriers to access so that the money is mobilized in the right time to have the right impact. And it has to be done in a collective way. Every country has its own responsibility, but we have a responsibility in a collective way to encourage each other to achieve targets and financing that will make the difference we need, not that we want, we need.
Absolutely, but you talk about encouragement. Are you encouraged by what you've seen so far of this summit, or do you feel from those nationally determined contributions that the various countries have now revealed that this is not going to work in terms of keeping 1.5 alive?
So let me tell you 2 things. We're moving in the right direction, but not at the right pace. The NDC Partnership is one of those vital platforms, a great initiative that recognizes the need to give the support that's fit for purpose, to provide the technical and financial resources for countries to assess their specific needs so that they can develop targets that make sense. And we are concerned that the targets set by some of the developed countries is not in alignment with what we need if we're going to stay below 1.5. Remember, if we go beyond 1.5, countries like Jamaica, like Barbados, the impact on us is much greater than the developed countries. So we have a greater stake as the more vulnerable countries to make sure that the collective approach is one that reflects the urgency of now.
Minister, thank you very much for joining us on Newsnight. Well, while scientists may differ on some aspects of climate change, there is a broad consensus. But what can we do about public attitudes? Polls do suggest increasing concern about the issue, but it seems many find talking the green talk rather easier than walking the life-changing walk. A recent Daily Mail poll suggested people supported Mr Johnson's bid to curb climate change, but weren't prepared to pay more than £5 extra a week in tax to fund the policies. Another poll published today by Portland Communications suggested only 7% of people in this country thought that families like theirs should be funding green transformation. Seema Kotecha has been in Dudley, testing the public appetite for self-sacrifice to save the planet.
It's no stranger to avid Newsnight viewers. The whiteboard, brought out at times of national debate. We've wiped away the cobwebs, made sure it's sturdy in its old age, and pulled off the former cards expertly used during the EU referendum. And it's no rocket science what today's about.
Ian, how worried are you about the climate from 1 to 10?
I'd say about 4.
You're very worried, so how many out of 10?
About 9.
9.
I'm extremely worried.
So 10?
Yes,
Wow,
definitely.
okay. Going vegan, for example, are you less likely, more likely, or somewhere in the middle to go vegan?
I'm not going to go vegan.
You're not going to go vegan, so where does that go? Is that less likely?
Very less likely.
Very less likely. If you ate less meat, you would save carbon dioxide, a lot of carbon dioxide.
Yeah, it's right there.
But you're not prepared to do that?
No.
Well, would you eat less meat, for example?
No. I think sometimes if we'd done that now, it'd be more harm than good to us, like when they're going about smoking. I ain't giving my fags up for nobody.
So you're not going to ditch a car then, or are you?
No, I wouldn't ditch it, but I'd change to the electric.
So you'd go electric car. Is that less likely, more likely, or somewhere in the middle?
More likely.
More likely.
More likely. What about buying less? You've got some lovely clothes on there. If you're going out on a Saturday night, are you going to go and buy a new
That's going
dress
to be
or a
less
new top?
likely as well.
So that's not going to happen?
No.
Okay, well, you have a very nice coat. Are you prepared to keep the same clothes for a lot longer? So buy less, perhaps recycle your clothing more.
Recycle my clothing more. I go to charity shops sometimes.
You do?
Yeah.
So buy less, more likely, less likely, somewhere in the middle?
Somewhere in the middle.
Somewhere in the middle. And what about plastic?
Plastic I recycle.
I live in a complex where there's 35 flats. All our rubbish goes down the chute, so there's no recycling.
What about a heat pump? They cost between £6,000 and £18,000, but the government has said they'll give you a £5,000 subsidy.
I never heard of that.
No, well, I was reading about one of those in the paper yesterday. Some couple had spent over thousands of pounds for the heat pumps for their entire house, and now them sitting there with their coats on.
Insulate your home.
Already done.
Already done. Whose job is it, Margaret? Whose job is it to enforce some of these restrictions if people believe in them? Is it up to the individual or is it up to the government?
Well, it's both, really. I mean, I think there's a lot of people who don't recycle as much as they should.
I'm in the black country where it's industry with all the factories and that and the smoke and that over the years. My husband used to work in the rolling mills and everything. So what difference is going to make now, sweetheart?
Of course, our opinion gauging with the board is not scientific, and as we pop it away for the next time some top-class analysis is needed, we leave you with the question, how far are you prepared to go to help the climate?
Seema Kotecha with some ground truth there. Well, we're joined now by Gabriel Milland from Portland Communications, who conducted some of the polling we mentioned earlier and is a former government advisor, and Liz Bonin, a biologist and BAFTA-winning filmmaker. Welcome to you both. Gabriel, it sounds like there's a bit of a job to do in terms of getting people to understand their personal stake in this.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the truism is that people are ready to do stuff, but they're not particularly keen on paying for it. So I think our poll found that only about 36% or so of people were willing to spend more than an extra £50 a month on top of the bills that they already pay to do something about tackling the climate. But the point also is that things are changing at a huge rate. Now, the trackers, the polls that look at things over time, show that just a couple of years ago, only about 20% or so, people thought that the environment was the most important issue facing them. In just a couple of years, that's gone up to the low 30s. So opinion is changing really quickly. Now, Seema's piece I thought was great. A lot of the people that she was speaking to, however, were pretty old, and that's another thing that's changing. The young have a very different attitude, much more engaged in this than older people are as well. So obviously we don't have a lot of time to play with, but things are changing at a really dizzying rate.
Liz, are you encouraged by that speed of change, or do you think it could be faster still? And how would you bring that about?
I think it needs to be faster. I mean, any change is good and public awareness is increasing. But I think what's glaringly obvious here is that part of the poll intimated that the public, feel confident about keeping 1.5 alive, but don't fully understand what that means and don't fully understand what net zero actually is. So for me, the most important thing here is, of course, the public plays a role in changing the planet to be a better place for our children and grandchildren. But more importantly, they're not informed enough, and it's all of our responsibility to inform them to a level where they actually understand what it means to try to get to net zero by 2050. I mean, to have a 66% chance of keeping 1.5 degrees C alive, we need to get to net zero by 2030. It's facts like what we're going to actually do to get to net zero, even by 2050, what kind of technologies are available. And when you unravel what's available, or more to the point, not ready to be even scaled to anywhere near the amount of carbon we need to suck out of the air, given the scale of our issue. I think those are the types of bits of information that we need to pass on to the public so that the polls can be more to do with, now that you know the truth behind a lot of these slogans and a lot of these pledges, how can we help you to put pressure where pressure needs to be put to enforce the change that needs to happen at other levels of society, not just from public behaviour.
OK. But in terms of the public behaviour, Gabriel, do you think in any way the whole experience of the COVID pandemic might in some way have prepared the ground a little in terms of sacrifices and people thinking more about the common good, or is it irrelevant in your view?
I think it's interesting in several ways. I think the thing that I would take out of COVID, and I did a huge amount of work on what the public were doing and thinking about the pandemic, is that there is a really crucial role for government in leading public opinion. Public opinion, as I said in the piece this morning, it's kind of like a Ming vase that needs to be carried across the room. But the government needs to lead that process. And so I think wartime metaphors, allusions are not helpful. I think they might feed even a sense of hopelessness. What's the point? The situation is so bad that we might as well just, open the windows or whatever. But I think there is a crucial need for politicians, and I think the Prime Minister gets this, and I think that's why he's made it such an important part of his premiership, for politicians to lead this process and to be committed to it.
Well, in terms of leadership, I don't know if you heard Allegra Stratton earlier, but she did say that the Prime Minister is about personal choice. And Liz Bonin, I wonder if that's enough from your perspective to leave decisions like whether you take a plane from London to Manchester down to personal choice.
No, it's not enough. I mean, our backs are against the wall. There's a lot of rhetoric going on here that I'm sort of uncomfortable with. The pandemic, as an example, I don't think is just about sort of how the public reacted and the potential in the public. What was very clear was that the government was able to enforce changes in how they spend money, we're able to protect livelihoods, we're able to just make so many drastic changes when needed that need to happen now. And I think we need to change the conversation about the responsibility on the public versus how the governments will then, tell them you choose what to do. I just think we need to be more informed about the reality of what we're facing, and absolutely empower the public, but with information, the right facts, the truth around a lot of these pledges, so that then together as a society we can actually help to enforce the change, as opposed to start making decisions about whether we'll take one holiday or two next year. That's not going to cut it. We need to know about what's happening at the fossil fuel industry level, at the policy level with respect to when these net zero pledges are going to be enforced, how they're going to be actioned. Okay. That's where I think we're going to get the biggest change quickly enough to solve this crisis.
And just briefly, Gabriel, Do you think governments still fear electoral consequences if they do try and put the prices of energy up or do other things to compel more environmentally conscious behaviour?
All the polling evidence, all the survey evidence, and the evidence of countless focus groups I've done as well is that the risk is probably on the other side. And politically for this government, I think the risk is that it is seen as not serious enough and that it gets into an arms race with the Labour Party, and there is a space which opens up for Labour to tap into the really large amount of public demand for something to be done and for action to be taken. So I think it cuts the other way.
Thank you very much indeed, Gabriel Milland, Liz Bonin. Thank you both for joining us. Well, we've just got a chance to have a quick look at the newspapers. The Guardian, COP26 world leaders agree a deal to save the Earth's forests. That's the encouraging news that was breaking when we were coming on air. The height of hypocrisy, Metro has, which is about the size of the motorcades, the number of private jets coming in and all that kind of thing. And then the Times answer the call of future generations, as we had from the Queen at the beginning, but also French delay, tough new checks on ports. Nick Watt is back. Is there the beginning of some sort of deal going on here?
I think there's a definite sign of calming of tensions between Britain and France tonight. And as you say, front page of the Times, they're talking about how President Macron has backed down from what they're talking about, how from midnight tonight, there were meant to be intrusive checks. British trawlers were not going to be able to land there. Catches in France, those are being put off. Now, on Thursday, Lord Frost, the Brexit minister, he will be meeting Clément Beaune, who's the French Europe minister, in Paris. Over there, President Macron was saying earlier that he's very pleased that Boris Johnson is having a discussion on the basis of a French proposal. The UK view is that the UK is very encouraged that France has acknowledged the need for in-depth discussions.
Thank you very much indeed, Nick. Well, that's all from us tonight, but do tune in for Emily and Kirsty tomorrow. From all of us, goodbye.